So I also wanted to say a special thank you to the Edgewater Neighborhood Association. They've been a fantastic partner with us around this meeting and getting everybody together, in particular Vivian Morris and Jesse D'Amberville. So thank you both so much. And if Vivian or Jesse wants to introduce themselves and say anything, just to kick us off.
So I'll just start first and just say welcome to everyone who's here. This meant a lot to us as a neighborhood association to be able to help all of us dig deeper into understanding climate impact in our community. We're very fortunate to live along the Neponset River. At the same time, while that provides the beautiful water and the green space, there are climate concerns because we live along the river as well, like potential for flooding. And we all have had, the impact of heat. And we in some ways are afraid that the loss of more trees along the river could hurt us in another way. So there's so many reasons why those of us who live along the river wanted to understand more. And for those of us who are here, I'm glad that you're here, and maybe what we can all do is help reach out to others with the things that we learned today, and help all of us keep going forward. So thanks to NepRWA and to MVP and MAPC and others. Jesse?
Well, very well said, Vivian. I can't think of a lot more to add to that, except for, yes, thank you for NepRWA for hosting this meeting, and thank you everyone for coming. All I can say about the river is that I consider the river as a neighbor, just like, one of my human neighbors, and it needs to be protected just as much as I want to protect my neighbors. And so we live along the river, and it's an incredible asset to our community. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity of us getting together more to see the environmental impact that will happen on this river and how we can help it.
Thank you so much, both of you. What we wanted to do is get everybody together, talk a little bit about climate change, but really make this a listening session and really hear from you, residents in the Lower Neponset, about your priorities and what is it that concerns you about climate change and its effects on our communities. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carrie Snyder. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Neponset River Watershed Association. And together with Van Du, who is an senior environmental planner with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, we're going to talk to you a little bit today about climate change and what its effects are today and what they're projected to be. We'll talk a little bit about the project that makes tonight's meeting possible. And then we want to break out into groups, although if we stay a small group, maybe we'll just stay here and talk amongst ourselves. But we want to talk to you about how some of these climate effects have impacted your day-to-day life and your neighbors' day-to-day lives. So first, I wanted to start with what I hope is an easy question. And you can feel free to unmute yourself and say your answer. You can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. But what I'd like to know is, what are some of your favorite things about the neighborhood in which you live? Does anybody want to start with something great about Mattapan, Hyde Park, Dorchester, Milton?
The river for me.
The river?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I was having some audio issues earlier. So yeah, I couldn't hear anything. So I missed a lot. So I apologize. So thank you.
We actually just started. You haven't missed much.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So yes, the river for me.
The river. Anybody else?
I agree with Lorraine. I think the river is probably, because I mean, I live right off of Edgewater Drive. The river is probably my favorite thing about the neighborhood. And of course, the food forest that will be open soon.
Excellent.
And the people.
Yeah.
Get the people.
Yep, definitely would say the neighbors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else? Any like regular activities, events, resources, anything come to mind?
I love the Greenway.
Yeah.
The Greenway is definitely that's my favorite. But again, that's part of the river.
Yeah.
I love Almont Park. I think we have a lot of great green spaces in Mattapan. We did a project recently with Speak for the Trees, and at one point we're planning on having like a tour of like trees in the area, and just going over the map in Mattapan, we realized, wow, how many urban wild areas that we had and how many green spaces that underutilized, but that there is a lot of green space in Mattapan. And I hope that is something that we can make them more utilized.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Jesse, and I'm sorry if I feel like I'm overtaking the conversation, but that's how I felt too when I first moved to the Mattapan Hyde Park area. I'm originally from Dorchester, and Mattapan always had like a negative affiliation with its surroundings. And when I moved to Mattapan, I was actually really surprised about how suburban it felt, and how many green spaces and open spaces there were. And again, the river. So yeah, that's one big thing about the area that I was surprised and happy to discover.
So I want to also say I really love the pictures that you have. The one in the center is a mural that was painted by young people under the city of Boston. And it was about the Edgewater neighborhood and the work that we're doing to try to make healthy food accessible. And one part, as Jesse said, is the food forest. The other part is the Kennedy Garden, which is also right along the river. So those are other, I think, really nice and special things in our neighborhood.
We also have some notes in the chat too. The people, the friendliness, the proximity to parks and walkways and the lower mills, how involved people are in the city, community, and community political activities, being able to walk to several places without having to take the bus when the weather is nice.
Mm. Nice.
Well, those are all great.
I agree with all those.
All right. Well, feel free to throw some more in the chat if you think of them. But we will start the conversation in earnest. So first, let's orient everybody. So this in yellow is the Neponset River watershed, which is really just an area of land that drains into the Neponset River. And these pink areas that you see all over are what we call the 500-year floodplains. And what that means is there's a 0.2% chance of that area flooding in any given year. And I think the reason that we've highlighted this is that as we go on through this presentation, you'll hear that while 0.2% doesn't sound like a great chance of flooding, that chance is really going to increase as climate change progresses. But the river runs from Gillette Stadium down in Foxborough all the way up to the gas tank up in Dorchester. I still want to say gas tanks. And encompasses, many parts of many towns, and it's a pretty diverse region. So what brings us here today is a project that's funded through the state Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP, program. And this focus group is really intended to be part of a more long-term effort to improve resilience within the watershed and within watershed communities. So this grant has been given to the town of Dedham, and it's got several core components. We're going to develop a computer model that's going to look at flooding today and projected into the future to help identify ways that we can reduce the risk of flooding. We're working with all of the towns to come up with a framework for collaboration on a number of different climate resilience projects in the future. We're going to provide some technical assistance to those towns. And we really want to make sure that the community is engaged and understands. Everybody's heard of climate change, but we really want to dig in and talk about what the actual impacts are going to be to people's everyday lives. What have they been so far? And really make sure that as cities and towns are looking to the future and future projects to adapt to the impacts of climate change, that they're really listening to residents and keeping those priorities in mind. So, and I guess I would just reiterate that tonight we really want to learn from you. We want to know, after we set the stage for climate change and what the impacts have been, we really want to hear from you about what that means in the real world. And you can find out more about the project at neponset.org/climate-adapt. And that'll come up again in our last slide. So climate change is here. I'm sure you've heard about it, but it is here. It doesn't show itself every day, but we're definitely seeing changes in long-term, weather patterns. And these patterns are most obvious when we compare, recent trends with historic trends. And just to define terms, so weather is what we're seeing right now. Weather is what we see on a daily basis. Climate is sort of what we see over the long term, say 30 years. And so what we've been experiencing are increases in average global temperatures, which may sound simple, but that increase in temperature has a significant impact on a variety of weather features. So why is the planet warming? So this might be review for a lot of you, but I just want to make sure that we're all starting at the same place. So this slide provides a snapshot of the concept of climate warming. So solar energy comes down to Earth from the sun, and some of that is reflected back out into space. And what's happened on Earth is that we have gases that are sort of in the atmosphere, and they form a blanket around the around the planet, and it holds some of that heat in. And we need those gases because that's what creates our atmosphere. That's what keeps the planet warm enough for life to thrive here on this planet. And most of those gases are, they're methane, they're carbon dioxide, they're commonly referred to as greenhouse gases. The problem is that since industrialization, we've seen a significant increase in those greenhouse gases. And that's due to the burning of fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, coal. All of those are putting these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere much faster than they would occur normally. And what's happening is this blanket around the planet has become much more efficient, and it's holding in much more heat. So what does that mean? So while we can engage in efforts to reduce the severity of global warming by reducing the amount of fossil fuels and gases that we're putting out into the atmosphere, some of the changes that have happened, some of the warming that's already happened is irreversible. And there are things that we can do about it. I don't want to create this dire picture. There are efforts there are actions we can take to reduce some of those impacts. But because we're already seeing this, because we've already experienced a change to our long-term weather patterns, we need to sort of take stock, and we need to figure out what those actions are, what's going to be most effective, and what's going to make communities more resilient. So before we start planning for those changes, we're looking at what they are. So we're seeing changes in precipitation, for example. And when I say that, what I mean is we're seeing a lot more rainfall as heavy rainfall. So we're seeing more flooding. We're also seeing more drought on the flip side. We're seeing sea level rise, which is causing flooding on the coast, and it's causing soil erosion. The rising temperatures in and of themselves are giving us more extreme heat days, more heat waves, which increases wildfire risk, and it really changes some of the species that thrive. So there are impacts to public health, and invasive species sort of thrive and squeeze out some native species. And then finally, we've got extreme weather. And when I say that, I'm talking more about winds. So, storms that can really knock power out for a good while. So we're going to take these one at a time. So we'll start with temperature changes. So it's projected that we'll experience more frequent high heat days. So those are days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So what you see here on the left is how the average temperature has changed over time to 2020. And you can see there's really a stark increase there, starting in the beginning of the century, late 1800s. On the right, you see what's projected to happen. The average temperature that you see in the red is the most extreme. So if we do nothing about fossil fuels, if we do nothing about greenhouse gas emissions, we are looking at some pretty severe increases over the next century. What you see in the blue is still an increase, but it's a more optimistic view, and that's if we can curb greenhouse gas emissions right now, we might be looking at something closer to the more optimistic view. But we really need to take action now. So what does this mean in our community? So this map shows you where some of the really hot spots are in Mattapan and Hyde Park. We're talking about a city, we're talking about a very urban environment with lots of pavement. And all of that pavement is reflecting the heat that's coming down. And you can see in the green, that's where most of the tree canopy is in these communities. And so those areas are going to be a lot cooler. So that you're not going to have the heat island effects that you see in these red spots. So you can see it's going up Hyde Park Ave and Blue Hill Ave. So, and I'm sure you all notice it when you walk around and go from a parking lot to under a tree. It really does make it a huge difference. The warming temperatures have also changed our precipitation patterns. So as I said, more of our rain is coming down as really heavy downpours instead of light rain. And while this isn't a presentation on stormwater management, what I do want to say is cities and towns have come up with ways to manage the rain that falls down onto paved surfaces. Ideally, these systems are going to move that water away from streets and sidewalks as quickly as possible so it doesn't build up and cause a flood. And it's primarily done using underground pipes, a series of underground pipes. The water flows into a storm drain and is directed really quickly out to a local stream. However, these systems are pretty old and they were not designed for these really heavy rainstorms. And they can become overwhelmed even when they're working as intended. This is an image from Norwood. This is Norwood Hospital in June of 2020. and Norwood experienced a very short duration, but very heavy downpour. And their stormwater management system just couldn't handle it. All the water, we discovered all the water wanted to collect downtown right by the hospital, and this hospital had to close. And that included their emergency department right at the beginning of a global pandemic. So that was a huge resource that was lost to this town, even though they did everything right. So these are some more precipitation change projections. And again, you see the high emission scenario. So if we continue business as usual, that's the blue at the top. But if we can, if we can start to curb some of those emissions, maybe we're looking at a more optimistic view. But I do want you to pay attention to the graph on the right, which shows what types of buildings are projected to be most impacted by stormwater flooding. And if you look, the great majority are residential buildings. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to, that cities and towns really need to pay attention to. And we need to adapt to make sure that those residences are protected or moved to safer locations. And I'm going to end there, and I'm going to turn it over to Van. And Van, just let me know when you want me to advance the slide.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. So with all of that information about rainfall and things like that, what you might remember was the series of flooding back in March 2010. It's quite a while ago, but I'm sure it was so severe that it was the series of storm that was federally declared disaster, and that FEMA made federal assistance available for residents who did not even carry flood insurance. So what you see on the map here are these purple dots. Those are the flood claims as a result of those storms that happened in that late winter, March of 2010. The Blue Hill Observatory in Milton recorded almost 18 inches of rain from 3 storms in 19 days between March 13 and 31st. So to just to show you, kind of get to Carrie's mention about the example in Norway, it's very intense, and it happened with the lack of capacity from our stormwater system, things like that. Things was really flooding. And then I want to show you also in the next slide, kind of make a connection of these flood claims. And just, we want to overlay to see with the environmental justice block groups, these are state designated data, because the point also to make is that climate doesn't impact everyone equally. So you can see here that the clusters of flood claims too happens to be in an area where there are folks of colors, marginalized communities, those that are also in the criteria as minority, low-income communities that are also experiencing this. And it's the physical impact mentally, as well as economically, severe and compounding impact to these communities, to our folks. And I'm showing you this March 2010 flood claims and incidents because this type of flooding is an example of the type of flooding that is predicted to occur more frequently as the climate warms. Meaning, again, as Carrie mentioned, extreme rainfall amounts falling in late winter as rain rather than snow on frozen ground, and while vegetation is still dormant. So this is sort of all of these things that are happening and create these flooding issues. And in the next slides, I want to show, zoom in a little bit more in detail to show just in the Mattapan and Hyde Park area. Again, here, the yellow dots you see are those 2010 flood claims. As you can see, if you remember the hotspot map that Carrie kind of show you earlier, it's somewhat connected and has the same pattern as where the hotspot are, along the Blue Hill Ave and Hyde Park Ave and things like that. These are kind of where these flood insurance claims also, these incidents are recorded as well. So just something to keep in mind. So if, and what we want to show here too is along the edges, you see there's the blue and aquamarine color as flood zone, FEMA flood zone. So the point to take away also is that even if you're not in these flood zones or floodplains, there during that March 2010 flooding, it happened just anywhere, really, not even in or outside of those flood zones. So in the next slide, I want to show there's I feel like we now, but I also want to assure you that we're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of climate action efforts in the communities across Boston that are happening. And the fact that you're here tonight is going to help us take it to the next level to make sure we're strengthening the community resilient, because we can only reduce emissions. We can reduce carbon emissions through mitigation actions like becoming more energy efficient, looking into clean energy and things like that. But we also think about the need to adapt to and be more resilient when thinking about managing the risk and the climate impacts that will be happening anyway. So making sure that our health and safety and also just services are ready to respond and help us recover if prevention is not going to be just enough. And with that, thinking about the food forest that you're having that local food, making sure there's education, climate communications around, or making sure everyone is aware of it, creating this community resources so that everyone knows if something happened. For example, when you talk about snowstorm in Boston, everyone knows to go get your shovel, get your salt, get your milk and ice cream and all that, and be ready, right? So when we're talking about these extreme storms, heat also, a lot more heat waves will be happening. We want to make sure that communities are prepared to have the same responses, knowing what actions to take and what the resources to tap into as well. And we can only be climate resilient when our communities are also being stronger and being resilient as well. So with that, let's pause for questions. We throw a lot of information at you, but want to give you time to ask questions too. So feel free to unmute and ask us questions or type in the chat and we can get to you. Any thoughts so far?
Do you guys, does the Neponset River watershed foresee the river rising?
Sorry, I can't bring up my control. So that type of flooding is certainly possible in certain areas. In the Lower Neponset, it's pretty channelized, meaning they did a lot of dredging and made it deeper and made the banks steeper. I might let my restoration director or my executive director jump in here, but while it's possible, it's more likely to we're more likely to see some of that stormwater flooding where that water is collecting in low-lying areas. There are plenty of spots in Mattapan that before it was built up was traditionally wetland. And so water always wants to sort of go to those places. So that's I think primarily the flooding that we're looking out for.
Okay. And you guys mentioned the flood claims. Do you foresee insurance rising as well in these neighborhoods as a result? Oh no, I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, so I know less about how the FEMA flood insurance works, other than So the way I understand it works is if you live in a floodplain. So if you live in one of those pink areas, for example, FEMA wants you to get flood insurance. And if those areas are going to be flooded more often, FEMA might decide that more people need to get that insurance. And I suppose it's possible that rates would increase.
And the reason I'm asking is because, as you guys probably know, we're trying to get a walking path built along the river, and the wall removal was in question. So if water is going to be rising, and we all know this, is the wall removal going to be a problem down the
I don't
line?
believe so. So when we looked at that wall, it was not a flood control wall. Those banks are really steep, and I can't even guesstimate how much water we'd need to see to see the river actually overtop those banks. So I know that was looked at early on before when we first started talking to DCR about that wall.
And yeah, and I know like climate change is big and we all should be talking about it, but I'm just kind of worried. I was kind of worried that the reason why we was having this focus was because like we were thinking about the rising sea levels. I mean, the water rising, the river, and potential flooding in those areas. And again, back to the wall design. And that was a concern that a lot of the residents had to begin with. So just making sure.
Yeah, and I'll defer to Andres Ripley to further answer that question, but my understanding is that that's not really a concern in that area.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I ask also a question about the 2010 flooding? And in the map that you showed, a lot of the, I guess the people had to put in for insurance coverage, right? That's what all the little dots were. And a lot of them, in the ones that are in Mattapan, they weren't anywhere around the river. So does that mean that mostly was around the issues with Boston Water and Sewer and the sewage issues?
Yeah, do you want to bring that just one of those map back up, maybe the first first one, just the purple dots one? Oh yeah, this one is fine. Sorry, just the closer to Mattapan, and one more down to the closer one. Sorry. But yes, Vivian, so these are flood claims that they the claims to not only just insurance claims, but to show that their house or properties was flooded. If you can go up down to the, and to your point, Vivian, you exactly show that a lot of the claims also that happen outside of the flood zones, FEMA flood zones, which is more on that lower, that blue, like teal color like. So whether people had flood insurance. So a lot of this are disaster assistance. So if you remember, I was saying that in that March 2010, there was federal assistance that needed to happen to support those that did not have carry flood insurance. Because as you see, and Carrie mentioned earlier, that unless you're in flood zones, technically you're not required to have flood insurance, right? So a lot of this happened outside of it, and yes, it is likely because of the backup storm water, because of the intense rain. It happens so much, and so there's just out of capacity for the stormwater system or pipes to really make sure it goes through, and so backup, and so people's basements were flooded. A lot of that was happening.
It looks like from this map that a lot of those might have happened around the Mattapan area. And from what I know, that definitely used to be wetlands area. And that's an area that does have issue from what I'm looking at, like where a lot of those dots are.
Right, that was cover up and fill in and built up, right? And so
That's wonderful to know. Thanks for that question, Vivian, as well.
Okay. Well, so this is, we record this and we hope you can, you can review this, you can share this too. I don't know, Carrie, how do you want, I think we have a small enough group, maybe we can stay here together and do discussions together.
Yeah, I think
Given
so.
the time, given the time, I think we can get going with some discussions. Like I said, this is, we want to hear from you. So maybe Emily or someone, or Carrie, do you want to share a screen of the Jamboard?
Sure.
And then we can kind of talk through together.
Yeah. Have
We
we
have a
stopped
quick
recording? I just
question.
want to make sure that.
Oh, yeah.